Hello everyone. Thank you for being here. Hope you have a relaxing and enjoyable time. The summer heat hung over Cedar Ridge, a quiet southern town nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. It was the kind of town where the local police station should have stood as a pillar of trust, a beacon of law and order. But over the years, whispers of corruption, misconduct, and unchecked abuse had spread like wildfire among the community. Marcus Holloway knew this well. Stepping out of his aging black sedan, Marcus pulled the brim of his baseball cap lower to shield his face from the scorching sun. He adjusted his plaid shirt, the fabric faded from years of wear, and dusted off his scuffed sneakers. To anyone watching, he looked like an average man. Certainly not the newly appointed chief of police for Cedar Ridge. That was intentional. Marcus had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. He had witnessed the best and worst of police culture, from officers who upheld justice with honor to those who saw their badge as a license for unchecked power. When he was offered the chief position in Cedar Ridge, he accepted with a purpose: to clean up the department and restore its integrity. But first, he needed to see the department for what it truly was, not through rehearsed speeches and formal introductions, but by walking through its doors as an ordinary citizen. As he approached the building, he could hear laughter and banter from inside. The parking lot was busy, officers moving in and out, engaged in small talk. None of them recognized him. And then, hey! A voice, sharp and dripping with authority, cut through the air like a whip. Marcus turned to see a broad-shouldered officer striding toward him. The man's badge read Officer Luke Harris. Behind him, a small group of officers leaned against the wall, watching with amusement. "Are you lost?" Harris sneered. "This ain't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." Marcus froze, the words hitting like a punch to the gut. He had heard this kind of tone before, not from those meant to serve and protect, but from those who abused their power. Before Marcus could respond, Harris stepped closer, his voice rising so his fellow officers could hear. "Didn't you hear me?" he spat. "Get the hell out. We don't need your kind hanging around." A ripple of chuckles and murmurs spread through the watching officers. Marcus remained still, his pulse steady. Then, without warning, Harris spat. The warm saliva landed on Marcus's face. The room erupted in laughter. Marcus didn't move. His hand clenched at his side, but not out of anger, out of control. Years of discipline, of handling men like Harris, kept him rooted. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his face with slow, deliberate movements. And then, in a voice calm but sharp as steel, he asked, "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" The laughter died. Harris smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." Marcus said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked toward the hallway leading to the precinct's main office. The intercom crackled to life, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The buzz of casual conversation filled the Cedar Ridge Police Department's briefing room. Officers strolled in, coffee in hand, chatting amongst themselves. Some laughed about last night's game, others exchanged jokes about routine stops. Officer Luke Harris stood near the back, his arms crossed, a self-satisfied smirk still lingering on his lips from earlier. He had dealt with men like that before, wanderers, drifters, people who didn't belong in his precinct. But he didn't think about it too long. This was just another morning. Captain James Calloway, a seasoned officer with graying hair, stepped to the front, clearing his throat. "All right, listen up. We've got an important introduction today." The room quieted, curiosity piqued. Calloway continued. "As most of you know, Chief Reynolds retired last month. Today, we welcome his replacement. I expect you all to show the new chief the same respect you showed him." The door opened and Marcus Holloway stepped in. Silence. At first, nobody reacted. Then a few heads turned, and the room shifted uneasily as recognition dawned. A few officers exchanged confused glances, unsure if they were seeing things correctly. And then, Luke Harris's smirk vanished. Marcus walked to the front with steady, measured steps, his posture upright, his presence commanding attention. He placed a folder with the precinct's official seal onto the podium, then finally raised his gaze to the officers before him. Then, in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, he spoke. "Good morning." The weight of his words hung in the air. No one dared to move. "My name is Marcus Holloway, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some officers stiffened. Others went pale, their postures suddenly more rigid. Luke Harris's face turned a deep shade of red. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment longer, letting them grasp the reality of what just happened. Then he continued. "When I arrived this morning, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. I wanted to witness firsthand the culture that exists behind these walls, when no one is watching." His words landed like a hammer. Harris shifted uncomfortably, sweat beginning to form at his brow. Marcus leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium. "And what I saw," he said, his voice dropping just enough to feel dangerous, was eye-opening. The tension in the room thickened. Some officers exchanged wary glances. Marcus let his gaze linger on Harris, just long enough to watch the officer's confidence crack. "The culture that has been allowed to fester here?" Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "It ends today." A wave of discomfort settled over the room. Some officers who had been laughing earlier now looked away, suddenly ashamed of the things they had tolerated. Harris swallowed hard. Marcus straightened up, his eyes cold and sharp as they scanned the room. "Respect is not optional," he said. "It's the foundation of what we do. Without it, we don't just fail each other, we fail the community we swore to protect." He let the words hang for a moment. Then, without breaking eye contact with Harris, he continued. "This morning, some of you laughed as what you thought was just another nobody got put in his place. You assumed that man, me, didn't matter." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus took a slow step forward. "But let me be very clear," he said, his voice like steel. "Everyone who walks through these doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not." Harris shifted again, his hands clenching at his sides. Marcus took a final, deliberate step forward, standing just a few feet from the officer. "Officer Harris," he said, his voice low but piercing. The man flinched. "You represent everything that's broken in this department." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Harris opened his mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "When you spit in my face," he continued, "it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, and every single person in this town who trusts us to serve and protect them." The officers in the room felt the weight of his words. Some stood straighter, suddenly aware that things were about to change. Harris's face was now a deep shade of crimson. The next words sealed his fate. "Effective immediately, Officer Harris is suspended, pending an internal investigation." Gasps rippled through the room. Harris's jaw tightened. He looked around as if expecting someone to back him up. No one did. And then Marcus added, his voice lowering slightly, "And for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist?" He let the silence stretch. "Think again." The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Officer Luke Harris stood rigid, his face a mixture of humiliation, anger, and disbelief. The man who had strutted into the precinct that morning with an air of arrogance now looked like someone who had just been blindsided by a freight train. Marcus held his gaze for a second longer, making sure the officer fully grasped the weight of what had just happened. Then he turned to the rest of the room. His voice, calm yet unyielding, carried across the room with the force of a gavel striking the bench. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his eyes sweeping across every officer present. "This is not just about one man. This is about all of you." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided eye contact, suddenly finding their coffee cups or the floor a lot more interesting. "What I witnessed today," Marcus continued, "was not a lapse in judgment. It was not a mistake. It was a culture. One that has been allowed to fester and spread unchecked for far too long." The air in the room grew heavier, thick with the realization that this was not going to be business as usual. Some of the younger officers, especially those who had been too afraid to challenge the system before, sat up straighter, as if finally seeing the possibility of something different. Marcus let that thought settle before continuing. "Change is uncomfortable," he admitted, his voice steady and deliberate. "I know that, but comfort has never been an excuse for wrongdoing." His gaze landed on a few of the older, hardened officers, the ones who had likely been part of the problem for years. "If you think I'm here to maintain the status quo," he said, "you're mistaken." Harris let out a harsh breath, finally finding his voice. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Marcus heard him, loud and clear. Without missing a beat, he turned to Captain Calloway. "Captain," he said, "I need a full review of Officer Harris's disciplinary record on my desk by tomorrow morning." Calloway nodded, his respect for Marcus already growing. Harris's nostrils flared. "So that's it?" he snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. "You're just going to waltz in here and start tearing apart good officers' careers?" Marcus didn't blink. "Good officers?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you think you are, Officer Harris?" Harris clenched his jaw but said nothing. Marcus nodded slowly. "Then tell me," he said, stepping closer, "what does being a good officer mean to you?" Harris swallowed hard, his bravado quickly crumbling. "Does it mean treating people with respect?" Marcus continued. "Does it mean protecting the community without bias? Does it mean upholding the law equally, not just for those who look like you?" Harris's silence was louder than any answer he could have given. Marcus took a step back and addressed the room once more. "If anyone in this precinct believes that what happened today was acceptable," he said, his voice low and sharp, "you are welcome to step forward and say so now." Nobody moved. Not a single officer spoke up. The shift had already begun. Marcus turned, walking back to the podium. "The days of looking the other way are over," he said. "If you're not willing to change to be better, then this is not the place for you." Another beat of silence. Then finally, Marcus closed the folder in front of him. "Dismissed," he said. One by one, the officers filed out of the briefing room, the usual chatter gone. Some walked in silence, clearly processing what had just happened. Others murmured to one another in hushed tones, their faces marked with the first signs of self-awareness. Officer Reyes, the younger recruit who had been with the precinct for only a few months, hesitated before stepping closer to Marcus. "Chief Holloway," she said cautiously. Marcus turned to her. She took a breath. I just wanted to say thank you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For what?" he asked. Reyes swallowed, clearly nervous but determined, for saying what needed to be said. Marcus studied her for a second, then nodded. "It starts with you," he said simply. "Do better. Expect better." She nodded firmly before walking away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the empty briefing room. As he exhaled deeply, he realized something. This was only the beginning. The rest of the day felt heavier than usual. The precinct, once filled with casual banter and unfiltered arrogance, now hummed with a strange unease. Officers moved about their routines, but something was different. Marcus walked the halls deliberately, letting his presence become a reminder, a silent declaration that things would not return to what they were before. But resistance was inevitable. By noon, rumors were already spreading. Some officers whispered that Marcus was too harsh, that he had come in with an agenda to tear down good men. Others, the ones who had quietly resented the toxic culture, felt a glimmer of hope but were afraid to say it out loud. The biggest challenge? Officer Luke Harris. Marcus expected it. Men like Harris didn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, just hours after the briefing, Captain Calloway knocked on Marcus's door, his face grim. "Chief," he said, "Harris has already filed an appeal against his suspension." Marcus barely reacted. "Of course he has." Calloway hesitated. "To be fair, Chief, we've always handled things like this internally before." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "And how's that worked out?" Calloway had no response. "I don't play politics, Captain," Marcus said. "We follow the process. If Harris wants an appeal, he'll get one. But I also want a full, unfiltered review of his record. Every complaint, every misconduct report, every quietly resolved incident." Calloway hesitated, then nodded. "I'll have it by tomorrow." As soon as the captain left, Marcus turned his attention to the real fight, changing a broken system. That evening, he stayed late, poring over old reports, identifying patterns. It was worse than he imagined. Harris wasn't just one bad officer. He was part of a network of enablers. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics, all swept under the rug, marked as resolved internally. Marcus set the folder down. He had known reform would be hard. But this was rotted from the inside. As he ran a hand over his face, his phone buzzed. Captain Calloway. "Chief, you should know, a few officers are already pushing back. Some are talking about putting in transfer requests. Others are saying they'll refuse to work under you." Marcus exhaled slowly, absorbing the news. Then, he simply said, "Let them go." Silence. "Excuse me?" Calloway asked. "If they think accountability is too much to handle," Marcus said, "then they don't belong in this precinct." Another pause. Then, to Marcus's surprise, Calloway chuckled slightly. "You know, Chief, no one's ever talked like that around here." Marcus leaned back, rubbing his chin. Maybe that's the problem. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time it felt like change was possible. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct before sunrise. He wasn't here to just lead, he was here to be seen. As officers arrived for their shifts, they found him already in the halls, coffee in hand, reviewing reports, speaking with the clerks, making his presence a part of the department's fabric. The message was clear. He wasn't going anywhere. By noon, the tension was unavoidable. A few senior officers still refused to acknowledge his authority. They worked with forced politeness, their eyes filled with resentment. Others, especially younger recruits, seemed curious, maybe even hopeful. Marcus had no illusions about the battle ahead. But then something unexpected happened. A young officer, Emma Rojas, fresh out of training, approached him hesitantly near the break room. "Chief, can I have a word?" Marcus gestured for her to step inside his office. She closed the door behind her and hesitated before speaking. I wanted to say, I think what you did yesterday was the right thing. A lot of us have felt uncomfortable about the way things have been, but we were too afraid to speak up." Marcus studied her carefully. "What stopped you?" She exhaled. "Fear. The culture. The idea that if you don't go along with it, you're an outsider." Marcus nodded. "And now?" She straightened. "I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Then let's get to work, Officer Rojas." That moment sparked something real. By the end of the week, more officers started speaking up, some privately, others more openly. The toxic culture wasn't just being challenged, it was being dismantled from within. But there was still unfinished business. Harris's disciplinary hearing was set, and Marcus would be there to see it through. The hearing, the final reckoning. When the hearing finally arrived, the room was packed. Harris sat across from Marcus, his face set in thinly veiled defiance. His lawyer made his case. It was a misunderstanding. He didn't know who Marcus was. He's a decorated officer with years of service. Then it was Marcus's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The problem isn't just this one incident," Marcus said, his tone even. "It's the pattern. It's the culture. This department has spent years protecting officers like Harris while failing the people we swore to serve." A murmur rippled through the hearing board. Marcus laid out every report, every misconduct complaint, every abuse swept under the rug. By the time he was done, the room was silent. There was no defense left to make. The ruling was swift. Officer Luke Harris, terminated. The future, a department reborn. In the days that followed, the precinct felt different. Harris's firing sent a message loud and clear. This wasn't just a symbolic change. This was real. Some officers left, others stepped up. Marcus continued the hard work, revamping training, enforcing real oversight, building bridges with the community. But the real proof of change came weeks later. At a community event, Marcus was approached by a young boy, maybe 10 or 11. The boy hesitated, then asked, "Are you really the chief?" Marcus smiled, "I am." The boy's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "My dad says cops don't care about us." The words hit hard. Marcus knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I promise you, we're gonna do better." The boy studied him. Then slowly, he smiled. And in that moment, Marcus knew, this fight was worth it. This was just the beginning. What is lesson here? 1. True leadership requires action. Marcus didn't just take the position, he made it his mission to change the culture of the department. Leadership is about accountability, not authority. 2. Respect is not optional. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness, whether they wear a badge or not. Prejudice and misconduct must be confronted, not ignored. 3. Silence enables injustice. A toxic environment thrives in silence. Marcus inspired officers to speak up, showing that real change happens when good people refuse to look the other way. 4. Change comes at a cost, but it's worth it. Transforming a broken system isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But one decision at a time, we can create a better future. 5. Your actions have power. Whether you're a leader or an everyday citizen, how you treat people matters. Small moments of courage, like speaking up, stepping in, or standing firm, can change lives. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments.